A few years ago, I was driving on the way to church and passed a neighboring congregation and their building, and I caught something on their sign out of the corner of my eye. And under the name of the church and the hours of services, it said, "Life is what happens to you while you're making other plans." You run across that before? That was the first time. I've read it many times since. But every time I read it, it has a way of speaking deeply to me. And it causes me to begin to ask some questions. What's happening to me while life is going on? Those questions arise as we're growing, as our young people do, into young adulthood. What am I going to do with my life? Is it college or job or military service? What am I going to do? What values am I going to live by? There are kids who want me to be part of their group, but I don't like some of the stuff they're doing. What does it mean to me to live my life, to be who I am? How am I going to relate to the opposite sex, the mysterious other half of the human race that I'm still trying to figure out? We struggle to find those answers, and as we do, life is what happens to us. That experience comes again somewhere in the middle of our lives. It's sometimes called midlife crisis. Happens to both men and women. We've lived enough years and established our families, and it's suddenly we look at one another and we say, where are we going? What's happening to us? The job somehow doesn't have the thrill, and we wonder, could I be doing something that's more interesting? Or we look at our partner and say, same old, what do I do now? And often we find couples begin to separate because they haven't kept the romance alive. We wonder what the future's going to bring. We suddenly realize that according to lifespan, we've lived half of it already. And we still don't know who we are or where we're going or what we really want to be. And I've discovered, as many of you have who've lived to about my age, that when you reach those golden years we call retirement, the questions still come at you. What do I do when I don't have to work every day? How do I fill my life space? How do my partner and I get along together when suddenly we're thrust together all day, not just part of the day? And then there come those issues. We find our bodies are aging and we're spending more time with doctors. We watch as those we've loved and shared life with begin to get sick and leave us in death. Is this all it is? What's it all about anyway? This morning, I want to share with you some thoughts that speak to those times in our lives when we could say life is just happening to us while we are making other plans. And I want to root it in these two scriptures that I shared with you, because they both speak in an interesting way about God, who is our home, and what that can mean for us. What does it mean for God to be our home. Lord, you have been our home in all generations. Through the passing of time, you are that one fixed spot that we can rely on and turn to again. We reflect on it and we realize that we're describing the power, the source of life that is in and under everything we know and experience. This world exists only because of the creative energy in creation that, for absence of another world, we refer to as God, the Eternal One. And we somehow sense that these lives of ours are lived trying to understand what it means to realize that there is a presence and power that we call God, which is at the heart of life itself. And then Jesus, on that last night he spent with his disciples, talked about returning to God and a home prepared for us. A home for us. This is Lent. It's the 7 weeks preparing us for Easter, describing the journey that Jesus was himself taking from his ministry in Galilee, where he was surrounded by the acclaim and enthusiasm of thousands of people, where his disciples spent time with him and he was teaching them what they needed to know in order to share the message he was giving them when he was no longer there. And in these last weeks, he discovers that he must go and confront what is opposing him in his world. The political and religious forces that didn't want change, that didn't want people raising questions. So he turned to go to Jerusalem. And he kept warning his disciples that he was going and there be betrayed and suffer and die. And the passage I read is the last night he spent with those disciples. In an upper room, they'd celebrated Passover, and then he took the bread and the cup and he said to them, "These are symbols of my life that is soon to be broken and poured out for you. I want you to remember me. Every time you break the bread and share the cup, remember me." Let those moments be filled with the memories of this time in our lives. And then he said, "I go to prepare a place for you. I go to prepare a place for you. And then I'll come again and welcome you home once more." I've thought about this theme for several months. I knew I wanted to preach a sermon on it. And here it is today. And it was stimulated by something I read, which I included in the bulletin today. One of the great Hebrew scholars of our generation, Abraham Heschel, was teacher in the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York City. He wrote a brief response to a comment to one verse in Psalm 112. "What can I give in return to God for all the blessings that he has given to me?" He said, life is the answer. And then death is a homecoming. What's he saying? If we expand it, what he's trying to say is that the verse in those Psalms is a reminder to us that all of us are surrounded by blessings without number. Every day, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food on our tables, the love that makes us human, the experience in our families, growing through the years. All that we see and have comes from God's hands. It's God's gift to us. That is not the prevailing attitude of our culture. They're saying all the things that matter in life are not being grateful for what you're given. It's accumulate all you can, collect all you can, gain as much power as you can. But the scriptures, Jesus' Bible, talk about a different perspective. Seeing life as a gift. And living out our years with the sensitivity to the beauty and wonder that fills every day. Taking seriously the words of Micah to do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with God. And he says, if we do those things, if we struggle to be God's people, then some amazing things happen. We have a different home. We have a different connection with the world and with its source. And when we live that way, we are already connected with what's enduring far beyond our own lives. The only way that I can talk about it that makes sense for me is to talk about two different experiences in my life. And one is the experience of being surrounded by and falling in love. I don't know about you, but I felt love surrounding my life ever since I was big enough to appreciate what was there. I was surprised some years later when talking to my mother when she was up in her 80s. She, after some moments of quiet, said to me, said, Don, you know, I think the day I realized I was pregnant with you was the worst day of my life. And I said, Mother, I'm glad you waited till I was 65 to lay that on me. Talk about life is what happens while you're making other plans. How many, I won't ask you to raise your hands, but how many of us have found that the unexpected was a baby that we had not anticipated? No? And yet I never experienced anything but love from my mother. As a matter of fact, she said shortly after that zinger, she said, you know, Don, you have been the most satisfying of all my children to me. I have 3 siblings. And I know it's because I shared some of her poetic, artistic, and imaginative vision of life that had so filled my life as she shared it with me as I was growing up. Because you see, life, the real mystery of life, is not summed up in the years that we live. It's what happens in those years. It's the fact that we are more than we seem to be. How do you describe what happens to you when there's music that begins to send tingles up and down your spine? Huh? How do you explain what's going on when you stand on the beach and the power of the waves, especially when it's storming, going in and out, and you sense the mystery and wonder? It's a whole different dimension of life. Or you stand on top of Mount Washington over in New Hampshire, and you can begin on a clear day to see nearly 100 miles. How do you make sense of all that experience, of fall colors and the changing seasons and the renewing of life in the spring? How do we explain all that? That's more than just filling our time and putting in our one day after another. It opens us to dimensions of life where we are touched and moved by and connected to the mystery and wonder that is at the source. And Abraham Heschel is saying that when we make that connection, we're already experiencing what it means to live beyond the limitations of our own brief lifetime. For we are connected with what is enduring and eternal. And we grasp some of it and live in some of it now. Friends, if you're like me, when you get to about 81, which is where I am, you realize that most of your life is over. If I live as old as my dad, I've got 4 years left. If I live as old as my grandfather's, I'd be already gone. I don't have a lot of time left. Not when I think of all I've done in these 81 years. But friends, I'm absolutely convinced that I'm connected in something beyond just my own life. That I'm connected to something that's enduring. And that when the end of my life comes, there's a home for me. There's a home that's waiting. And that's for you to claim too. We don't need to be fearful about what tomorrow brings, about what injuries or illnesses or tragic circumstances may come into our lives. And they may come because we are living in what is eternal, in God's love and care for us. When I was growing into young adulthood, fortunately, somebody opened to me a writer that I hadn't remembered finding before, William Saroyan. An Armenian American, grew up in California in an Armenian community in the 20s and 30s, and wrote absolutely charming stories in which he tells his own experience, and as he tells the incidents in his life, he has a way of hooking into your own story. And it gave me more insight into how I lived and what had happened to me. And he has one chapter in one of his books which I found absolutely compelling. It really describes his experience in the Second World War, when as a young man he went into military service. He He and his buddies had finished boot camp in California, and they were all put on a train to go east because the war was even expanding in Western Europe. They hadn't opened the Normandy invasion, and so the invasion of Northern Europe was still coming. And they were put on a troop train that was taking them east to a troop carrier that would take them to Europe and to the fighting. And he describes that as they were sitting on the train with, the train going around the curves and the car swinging this way and that, they tried to fill the time by telling stories, and then they began to try and figure out if they could just sing to help pass the time. So they went through all the bawdy songs and the tavern songs and the folk songs and the popular music, and they finally got to the songs that they'd sung in Sunday school and church. And he describes that as that train was traveling along, swaying back and forth on the track, they began to sing. I'm leaning on the everlasting arms. What have I to dread? What have I to fear? I'm leaning on the everlasting arms. Going into the unknown, to the fighting that was before them in Europe, to the deaths of many of them. Leaning, safe and secure from all alarms. I'm leaning on the everlasting arms. That's what we have surrounding and beneath our lives, which give us the strength to live each and every day. Think of that marvelous tradition that so often we take for granted out of our African American sisters and brothers and their testimonies to faith. Soon I will be done with the troubles of the world, going home to live with God. Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me home. That's our faith. It's a faith that helps us make sense of all the confusion that surrounds us in the world and that fills our lives. It's that assurance of knowing we are connected to the very source which is life itself that gives us the strength to face and endure those times when life falls in on us. When we found ourselves trapped in just putting in time as the years pass while we've been making other plans. That's our faith, dear friends. You have a home. You have a home that God's prepared for you and for all of us who live and die faithfully as God's people. Thanks be to God.